Hey YouTube, what's up? Mike the Manic Geek here. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Antec P50. Now, this is a micro ATX enclosure that's part of their performance series of cases that also promises sound dampening and low noise optimization. So without further ado, let's just get right to it, take a look at the outside, take a look at the inside, get some hardware in there, and find out if this case delivers. So we'll start off with the front of the case here. We can tell it has that same sleek, clean, monolithic look that the rest of the P-Series cases have, as well as a very subtle Antec logo here at the bottom and your singular 5¼ bay right here. The side of this panel is also well ventilated, so any of your intake fans up front are still going to have plenty of air supplied to them. Moving to the front I/O, we have your complement of 2 USB 2 ports, 2 USB 3 ports, your audio jacks, as well as your power and hard drive activity lights. Now, it is important to note that these are not integrated into the front panel, so removal of the panel will leave these in place, which is going to be really nice when we get to dust filtering later on. Now, moving up to the top of the case here, we have your 2 fan speed controller switches, each of which is a two fan switch, so 4 fans in total here with 3 different positions. You also have your power and reset buttons, which although they feel kind of cheap, they do have a very satisfying click to them and require a noticeable amount of force in order to press down. So there's not going to be any accidental powering down or restarting of your computer here anytime soon. You also have a roof panel that, like its older P70 brother, is capable of being slid out and removed to reveal room for up to 220mm fans up top, as well as up to a 240mm water cooling radiator. More on that later. I think the only thing that I wish was going on with the roof panel is that there was some dust filtering present here. Otherwise, it's a pretty solid design and it works to keep everything easy to work on. Now, coming over to the rear of the case, we see that we have your typical rear I/O as well as room for 2 80mm fans. This was an interesting choice on Antec's part, and we'll discuss that more later when we talk about the hardware being in here. But just know that that does mean that this case is a bit more narrow, so that's going to influence some of your hardware choices. You also have your 4 PCI Express expansion slots at the bottom, and although 2 of them still use those janky punch-out PCI Express covers that can't be reused, ultimately, if you're building in a system like this, chances are there's going to be at least 1 PCI Express peripheral on your motherboard, so I can forgive that in this case. You also have a Kensington lock style flip cover for your PCI Express slots to make sure that if you do take this to a LAN event somewhere, that no one's gonna, be tempted to nick your hardware. Now, as I mentioned previously, this is a dual chamber case, so for the right side of the chamber, we have this little panel here that gives you rear access to your hard drive bays. This is a really nice feature, and I also like that they include an 80mm fan on this panel. Now, normally I'm a bit of a stickler when it comes to noisy fans, but I have to actually say that this fan was the quietest fan in the entire case. Granted, that's partially a byproduct of it not spinning particularly fast, but it works as an excellent option to make sure that there's airflow moving over your hard drives to any capacity to keep them from even getting the slightest bit hot. So great touch there, Antec. Now, we do also see here that we have room for a vertically mounted power supply. Of course, the fan does have to stick towards the outside of the case, but again, we'll get into that later on in the video. Now, I just want to touch on the case feet here really quickly. They're plain black case feet. They blend in really nicely with the visuals on the case. But the problem is they're plastic and they don't really have any sort of rubberized cover on the bottom of them. So the case may slide around a little bit if you bump it, and it may actually wind up leaving marks on whatever desk you set this on. So keep that in mind and maybe consider getting some felt pads on the bottom of these or something. I would like to see this improved in future revisions of the case. Now, as we start getting into the interior of the case, the front panel is pretty easy to remove. Just reach from underneath and pull out. But there's a bit of a missed opportunity here. There's no sound dampening material on any of the front cover of the case. Maybe that's because there were too many prongs sticking out here. I'm not entirely certain, but I feel like this really was a missed opportunity, and it is definitely an opportunity for a modder to come through and either correct this or potentially use this as added inflow for a different fan layout maybe. Now the dust filter on the front of the case is a thing of beauty. I love it. It doesn't use any janky, stupid magnets to hold it to the front of the case. It actually clips in, covers the entire front, is a nice fine mesh. It's easy to clean. It's got some pretty good build quality to it, and it slides back in just as easily. Great job on this implementation, Antec. Now, as far as the optical drive bay is concerned, that is actually a removable ordeal, but should you decide to keep it in your case, it does also function as a spot to store more hard drives. In this case, up to one 3.5-inch hard drive or two 2.5-inch hard drives. Now, as I previously mentioned to you guys, the front I/O for this case is not attached to the front panel. However, the power reset switch and your fan speed controllers are attached to the roof panel. So should you need to remove the roof panel for anything, you're going to need to keep that in mind moving forward. Now, getting into the actual interior of the case, we do have some pretty basic side panels with just some regular thumb screws holding it in, no captive thumb screws or anything like that. It's almost disheartening at first because this side panel is not winning any durability awards. It might actually even double as a decent springboard for your swimming pool. But that being said, even though they use a fairly thin metal for this case, the rest of the case is actually surprisingly rigid. It doesn't budge at all when I try to flex this thing. So I'm honestly fairly confident that my hardware will stay nice and safe inside here. Now, the other thing to look at here is the odd choice of sound dampening material that they use here. It almost reminds me of a thick vinyl wrap that you would put on something. Now, as to the actual effectiveness of this material, I'm not entirely certain, since this seems focused more on refracting sound rather than simply baffling and absorbing it. But it does the trick pretty decently well, I found. When I went to go test what a full complement of fans sounds like in this case, I actually had a hard time picking up anything apart from the sound of my AC unit outside my apartment. So realistically, this is a fairly quiet case, provided that, as always, you get quiet hardware to go inside it. I couldn't really hear the supplied fans when running at low speed unless I had my ear planted pretty much right on the case. So again, great job with sound optimization in this case and making sure that it's as quiet as it can be while using questionable materials. Now, once you get into the main chamber of the case, you have a nice, clean, logical layout with room for 220mm fans up front in two different positions. More on that later. You also have room for an extra 3.5-inch hard drive in the floor of the case should you desire. Just keep in mind that if you were planning on doing an SLI micro ATX build in here or a Crossfire micro ATX build, that if you put a hard drive down here, you will not have room for a second graphics card. Just like if you put a second graphics card in there, you will not have room to house the 3.5-inch hard drive here. Now, the main issue that I have with the internal main chamber here is the CPU cutout. Essentially, it's useless. What happens is the hard drive cage in the secondary chamber winds up covering up the top half of the cutout, while the power supply covers up the other half. It wouldn't be so bad if the main hard drive cage were removable, but as it stands, there essentially is really no CPU cutout here. So just bear that in mind when you build in this case. You're going to need to attach your heatsink to your motherboard before you go to install it. And even then, when you go to replace it, you're going to have to remove your motherboard to install it. It's more of an inconvenience than anything else, as the rest of the case is, again, very logically laid out, and it does make a lot of sense otherwise. Now, moving to the secondary chamber, we see a very similar side panel here, but there is also some dust filtering for the power supply. Now, it is a magnetic dust filter. It frankly looks extremely poorly made, but functionally it works really well. So if it looks stupid, but it works, it ain't stupid.
right?
Now, the only real critique that I have of the dust filter here is that the mesh isn't particularly fine. I would have liked to see a mesh similar to what they used for the front of the case here, but to be fair, power supplies don't really draw in a whole heck of a lot of air, so I don't expect that it should be getting too particularly dirty back there anyway. Now, when we start looking at your storage options back here, we have three 3.5-inch drive bays, which can also double as 2.5-inch hard drive bays, as well as two dedicated solid-state drive bays in the front with clips that allow you to simply slide your hard drive into the slot, not have to use any fasteners to worry about it. Now, one thing that I am really excited to see about this case, all of the cables are black. For as relatively inexpensive a case as this is, they were still able to provide the users with solid black cables for everything. Antec, once again, thank you for seeing reason, for seeing the light, and giving the builders what they want. Monochromatic cables. It matters. Now back here we do also have an extra accommodation up front for a second 80mm fan to act as intake directly across your hard drives here. This is a really nice layout that makes perfect sense in my opinion. It makes it so that your hard drives are kept separate from the rest of your heat generating components in the computer, but it doesn't completely starve them of air like several other cases wind up doing out there with their hard drives. So once again, Antec, despite the little snafu with the CPU cutout area, really is thinking through what the most important features are for this case. Now, actually getting hardware inside the case and doing up a reference system just to sort of give you guys a visual cue of what to expect here, I found out some very interesting things here. First of all, if you're going to go with a fully water-cooled system in this case, I would actually recommend going ATX here instead of going with a micro ATX motherboard. The reason for that is because when you start populating radiators in here, you discover a couple of things. First of all, you'll discover that setting a radiator in the roof is actually very limiting in that you can only have the barbs facing the front of the case. Unless you have a specialized radiator with end tanks that have multiple outlets all over them, then you're going to run into an issue where your end tank that faces the secondary chamber is going to be completely blocked by your hard drive bays. So that orientation won't work. What I did find interesting, however, is that if you use a radiator with a built-in reservoir similar to, say, one of the SwiftTech H220 radiators, you'll find that setting the barbs at the front of the case will leave exactly enough room for you to be able to access the end tank through the roof, which means you'll have a dedicated fill port at the highest point of your water cooling loop, which is extremely convenient, especially when you have a fully water-cooled system. It's one less part that you're going to have to remove in order to get the job done. Now, when I started trying to populate radiators into the front of the case, I noticed that that's where that's where more restrictions come into play. You can only really have a single 120mm radiator at the bottom of the case should you decide to go for multiple radiators in here. Because if you try to set a second radiator in here, you have to use the secondary fan openings that are on this case. Not only that, but you're going to wind up with a problem where the top of the case right here doesn't leave enough room for the barbs for the top radiator, which has to face the front of the case, to receive any of your tubing. So if you're going to do full water cooling, the most you can fit in here is a 240mm radiator in the roof and a 120 in front. That's all. That's also why I recommend an ITX build for full water cooling, because not only are you going to have more than enough radiator space to take care of a CPU and a graphics card, but you're also going to have more room to deal with cable management, since even with just this one radiator set here, it's actually very difficult to route cabling through the frontmost grommet for your 24-pin outlet. Now, you can set an all-in-one radiator in the front of up to 240mm in size, but that will automatically restrict your roof usage to just fans. The other thing too is that even if you try to set an all-in-one cooler in the roof, it's not really going to work because of how the motherboard tray is positioned. It would make it so that you would require extremely flexible tubing in order to use a radiator in the roof up here, and there aren't very many options like that out there. Now, the other thing I want to talk with you guys about is cable management. Cable management is a breeze in this case. That's partially a byproduct of the fact that it's a dual chamber design, but it's also a byproduct of the fact that they really thought about how cabling is going to need to run in this case, both for air and water cooling, and they give you all the tie-down points in the world. I even managed to do all of the cable management in this case just with the zip ties that are supplied in the little box o crud that they supply to you with this case. Now, one thing that I will say is that the instructions supplied for this case are just plain not good. If you're a novice system builder, I would highly advise seeking help from a friend who has built computers before to help walk you through the best practices for a case like this. But in reality, if you've built even one computer before, then you can probably maneuver your way around this case just fine. Because like I keep on coming back to, everything is logically laid out here, and everything for the most part makes a lot of sense. Now, another thing that I want to touch on real quickly here is the fans. The supplied fans for this case, while a little chatty at top speed, at low speed, are perfect for this case. Even despite the fact that they don't really move as much air as I'm used to seeing moved with an airflow optimized fan option, even with the fan speed controller running them at lowest speed settings, I could feel air actually escaping out the back of the case, which is pretty impressive to me. That tells me that there is exactly enough room in this main chamber to make sure that even if you have fairly weak fans, you're going to get solid airflow through this case. Now, as far as these two rear 80mm fan openings are concerned, me personally, I would do one of two things here. I would either use this to mount a reservoir and pump combination for a custom water cooling loop, or I would fabricate some kind of sound dampening panel to go here and make it so that the only place where air is actively escaping from the case is through your PCI Express slots and the other nooks and crannies that are present here. Mounting fans here probably isn't going to do as much for you as mounting the 80mm fans on in the secondary chamber for airflow over your hard drives, but I leave that decision up to you. The main reason I suggest avoiding 80mm fans here for the most part is that most 80mm fans aren't particularly quiet. Even if you were to source several of the Antec specific fans, you'd get a little frustrated with them, mostly because they're Molex powered. So that's it's a bulkier cable terminal to try and manage, and frankly, there's no clean way of doing it back here. Now, admittedly, this case doesn't have a side panel window, so you're not going to necessarily need to worry about that. But for those of you that do get the window panel option of this case, and there is one out there, that's something that you're going to want to be concerned with. So ultimately, that's my recommendation for these slots back here. All right, boils and ghouls, it's conclusion time. So, what are we getting here for a $70 case then? Well, you're getting good looks, you're getting silence, you're getting a feature-rich case, you're getting all the right combination of ingenuity and compromise for the price here, I feel. I would admittedly like to see the addition of a card reader on this, something for micro SD cards. And I feel like that would be worth an added premium in this instance because really this screams micro ATX workstation or home theater PC or server because of all of the myriad number of hard drives that you can hold in here, the clean look on the outside, the silence optimization, room enough for this. There's not much real competition, frankly, for this case in its pricing bracket. Yes, there are other competing solutions that are out there, but frankly, for what you get here, as opposed to the other ones, really the only reason I could consider not getting this is if it just won't fit on your desk because of the width. Now, that being said, one of the main downsides for this case is the width. Like I mentioned earlier, it's not really wide enough to accommodate something like a Hyper 212 Evo. So when you're shopping for an air cooler for this, you want to make sure that it's either a downdraft heat sink or that it's not particularly tall here. But really, apart from that, I can't really complain about anything here. This is a great step in the right direction for Antec, and if you guys haven't checked out one of their cases recently and you're looking for something that's low cost, feature rich, and that has all the right compromises made for a solid building experience, I personally recommend you check this one out. But let me know what you guys think about it. What do you all feel about this dual chamber design thing with cases that's become popular over the course of the past year or so? What do you think about this case? Love it, hate it, good experiences with it, bad experiences with it? I want to hear about it down in the comments below. If you guys haven't done so already, be sure to subscribe, do that thumbs up, thumbs down, and sharing thing like you do, how you do. Also, remember, if you're feeling a little generous, stop by the homepage for the YouTube channel and hit that support button. Every penny you guys send helps the Manic Geek cause. But anyway, guys, until the next video, this has been Mike the Manic Geek. Take it easy.